Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. If you're new to the show, this is John Moretta. He's been on multiple times, and also I'm doing a bit of an RFK Jr. impression, but really, my voice is shot. So hopefully Mr. Moretta can introduce himself, and he'll probably do a lot of the talking, hopefully. We're going to be talking about LBJ and the Southerner, this title that gets put on LBJ, which is actually kind of good and bad when you look at his presidency.
Yeah, I'm John Moretta. As Robbie mentioned, I've been on this wonderful show several times. We've had great conversations, and I hope those who view us have learned a lot about a variety of topics that Robbie and I have discussed. I am currently a professor of history at Houston Community. Actually, we're called Houston City College now. Went through a name change back in September. I've been there for 40, it's my 44th year. Can you believe it? I have a PhD in history from Rice University. I've written several books and articles over my professional career on a variety of topics. My most recent book, which should be out sometime in the summer of this year, 2026, is a in-depth study of the Austin SDS movement and counterculture movement during the 1960s. And my thesis for that is that is that decade and those movements that made Austin what Austin is today in so many ways. Anyway, that's who I am.
We've had many conversations about RFK, JFK, LBJ, the hippie culture, and people can look at those past episodes. But I wanted to kind of bring you back on to talk about LBJ again. Now, last time we discussed LBJ and RFK a little bit, that relationship, which we probably might even divulge a little bit in this one as well too. But I wanted to talk about, like I said in the beginning, about the Southerner aspect of things. When you hear that word, a lot of people tend to think like big straw hat or big country hat, and then they tend to think of like a person that's kind of stuck in their ways and kind of not really equal to a lot of things. But it's kind of a misnomer when it comes to LBJ, because there are some things you can say about him, but there's a lot of things that with the Southerner that kind of brings in that helped me understand more about the political workings of the time and probably how it still goes today. So I kind of wanted to get your opinion on the name the Southerner, and also what qualities did that come out good or bad in LBJ?
You bet. One of the most fascinating things about Jones, one of the most intriguing things, maybe that's a better word, about LBJ, is like most Texans, and many of your viewers may know this, and yourself included, myself included, we do not see ourselves as Southerners. Now, having said that, when you look at Texas history, the majority of white original settlers came from the South to Texas, beginning with Stephen F. Austin and his and all that first wave of what were called empresarios, right? These were massive land grants given by them, initially the Spanish government, but they were out, by the Mexican government in the 1820s to help populate and develop Texas, one of their most vital, what was called borderlands. When Mexico declared independence from Spain, 1820s, or early 1820, in matter of fact, they inherited what were called the borderlands, roughly present day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, parts of southern Colorado, a little bit of Utah, even a little bit of present day Oregon. So it was a massive territorial acquisition by the Mexican Republican government, small r. Okay. And Spain had been successful, Mexico successful in colonizing and developing California. Texas, even greater vast potential, had a difficult time settling. So they invited the Anglos, right? They had no choice. Great irony, these Anglos, many of them came as illegals, despite the invitation of the Mexican government with these empresario grants. So back to the relationship to LBJ, the majority of Texans, 90% of them, in the pre-Civil War period, came from either the lower South or the upper South, okay? But they were, quote, Southerners, and consequently brought with them all that cultural baggage including slavery, racism, xenophobia, Protestant fundamentalism, evangelicalism, and they brought it all. Okay. However, over time, a post Civil War period, um, a very key part of Texas, where LBJ is from, called the Hill Country. Okay, the area surrounding Austin, Fredericksburg, Comfort, Burnett, all these areas, the Hill Country, where there are hills, right? Not mountains, hills. A very important non Anglo Saxon European population settled there. Germans fleeing, they came in the 1840s, 1850s, so pre Civil War period. Same time that the Irish were fleeing the potato famine and uh, that kind of destitution, the Germans from various parts of Germany, there's no united Germany yet, that's until 1870, right? Will come to Texas. And they and if you look at this is very important because it kind of speaks to how LBJ developed his politics. Okay. The majority of these Germans who came to the United States 1840s, 1850s, unlike the Irish, were extremely well off, well educated, mostly middle class. They were mostly political refugees. Okay. They were Catholic and Protestant, well, like I said, well educated, well informed. But like the Irish, Anglo Saxon, white America in this time period, 1840s and 50s, were equally nativistic toward the Germans as they were towards the Irish. And the Germans obviously felt this. But unlike the Irish, the Germans had the financial, economic means to move as far west as they possibly could to escape this very, at times, vicious Anglo Saxon nativism toward the other in this first wave of immigration, or significant immigration to the United States. It was mostly the Irish and the Germans. The Irish did not have the financial means to leave the East Coast. So you see the concentration of Irish immigrants in New York, Boston, other East Coast cities, whereas the Germans moved as far west as possible, right? I.e., Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right? Relatively new states to the Republic, St. Louis, Missouri, home of Anheuser-Busch, and even more, not even more, but quite a few went as far west or southwest as Texas. They did not settle, these Germans, and some Eastern Europeans, Slovaks, Poles as well came with them at different phases. And they settled as far away as they could from the mainstream Anglo Saxon settlements in Texas. The lion's share of the Germans went to present day Fredericksburg, which is just outside of Austin, about an hour, in the heart of what's called the Hill Country. Some of your viewers, if they're Texans or whatever, are perhaps familiar with this region of Texas. And there they would develop a very unique culture and political environment. They will be very tolerant. They opposed slavery, hardcore supporters of the Free Soil, the emerging Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. They will vote against secession when the referendum was held in Texas to leave the Union, 1860-61. But most important, they will place a lot of emphasis on toleration. They were liberals, in effect, right? The first real significant group of Texas liberals. That has completely changed in the Hill Country now. My wife and I were there about 2 years ago. Oh, actually, no, we were there 2019, 2020. We were there at the time of the 2016 election. We used to love to go. We were thinking about buying a second home. And we were just appalled, amazed at the same time of how many Trump flags we saw and how red that part of Texas had become, which was a shock because that part of Texas, which included Austin, had been for decades, over a century, the cradle of Texas liberalism, right? And we won't delve into why that metamorphosis took place in the hill country. It's not part of the subject. Relative to LBJ, this is where LBJ was born. In a small town, Johnson City, just by coincidence, it was called Johnson City, in the heart of the hill country, right? He was referred to those white Anglos who moved to this part of Texas after the Civil War, right? None of them had been slaveholders, right? Many of them were racist, but they were not, they opposed slavery. They were, quote, liberals, and whatever that term meant in the mid to late 19th century, right? Unlike today. And so Johnson grew up in this environment that was Southern in a very barest term. You could use that with an origin, right? But he saw himself always, as Texans do, as Texans first, right? Americans and then Southerners. So an integral part of LBJ's political identity and emergence was that yes, when you listen to all of LBJ's speeches and phone conversations, which you and I have shared and talked about, he has this what people say this horrible Southern drawl, right? Well, yes, but it's not a Southern drawl that you would hear in a Georgia or a Tennessee or South Carolina, that kind of Tidewater drawl. Even in Maryland, where you are, you have that Tidewater Southern kind of accent, not as pronounced as other places, right? But Johnson did have that stereotype. He was a caricature of a quote Southern. He was not a Southern. He hated to be labeled a Southerner. He always took pride in being an American first. And if any regional identity he embraced, it was that of a Texan. This is true of all Texans, including myself, right? And so he grew up in this very unique, multicultural, multi-ethnic environment, African Americans, Germans, Anglo-Saxons. He was often referred to as a cedar chopper, a roper, cattle roper, sheep roper. I mean, they had all these kind of interesting pejoratives, but that's how he identified himself, right? Even though across the nation, when he would give speeches and such, he sounded like a Southern. But if you're familiar with regional dialects, and he was a Texan.
Well, a lot of people associate like this with the Southerner. They associate like buffoon, which I think is like kind of like this another misnomer, or kind of like just when they describe Johnson, that's what they bring up. But I think the Southerner gave him a more of a benefit and understanding how to not have to tiptoe around certain things. The upfront nature, take the media for instance. He wasn't good at, dealing with all these Washington, New York, all these reporters where a lot of their backgrounds are those kind of tight, very not, I wouldn't say liberal, but more clean, I would say. Just like more when it comes to like a high class royalty style. Um, and LBJ wasn't like that. I mean, he's on photos of him pulling up like his shirt and showing his gallbladder scars. And then there was a big incident with a beagle where he was holding the dog by the ears, and the press just ran with it. And it's kind of like this is someone that the press doesn't like because of his demeanor and because of his way of doing things. JFK is the complete opposite. He's more of a clean, seemed like he came off with a more like, I went to a very private school, and LBJ's more public school.
Yeah, oh yeah. LBJ grew up public school, elementary school, high school in the Hill Country, public institutions. When he went to college, he went to Texas State Teachers College, which is Texas State today in San Marcos, right? And we talked this before. LBJ, when he graduated from college, he was a high school teacher, taught at two different high schools in Houston, Texas, and started out in small Hispanic school in South Texas, right? Uh, in Cuero, and moved to the big city in the 30s, Houston, and taught public school, taught English, but really he taught public speaking and debate. And he had one of the better high school debate teams at Sam Houston High School in Houston, Texas in the 30s. One took his kids all over the state, winning all kinds of debate matches. But you're right. The American public always saw Johnson, no matter how he tried to minimize that Texas drawl, as a Southerner. And something you kind of intimated just a few minutes ago, was LBJ, once he entered politics, he very quickly attached himself, as we've talked about this before, to guys like Richard Russell and other Southern establishment politicos. And so that kind of further cemented in the mind of the Eastern establishment, i.e., the Kennedys and that wing of the Democratic Party, that he was a Southerner, right? But Johnson's affiliation, attachment to guys like Russell and others was purely politically motivated. He saw that as his entree to the cloakrooms and the power center of the Senate once he became a senator. When he ran for his first elected office, member of the House of Representatives, he lost, not by much. He lost to a hardcore conservative, racist individual, ran again after he got out of the service, and won barely. And I think we might have talked about this before. It was a very corrupt election. He apparently a lot of dead people in South Texas voted for him. Rumor has it, and he won by only several hundred votes. And he was referred to comically as landslide Lyndon. Didn't make any difference. He still won.
To be
He had a
fair,
member.
I think that's pretty common. Like even with like, there's a small amount of election, not fraud, but I do believe there's a bit, whether it's online or whether it is like in today's age. But back then, you hear Johnson even talking about where Kennedy exactly pulled his funds from to be able to raise the money to get his votes. Certain connections that he had. He's talks about his dad's money in a couple phone calls. LBJ had the Box 13 scandal, but at the same time, I think LBJ knew that if he made friends with powerful oil people or just some type of establishment figures, that he was going to be able to get things across. Friends help friends. That was his mentality. So I need to get in with good friends. And that's what he really tried to do. But again, if you scorned LBJ, the Southerner aspect came out, which was I know how to make it to where you're not going to be able to do anything and you're going to want to quit. And that was LBJ's kind of mentality. He was very friendly with people and kind of pushed them when he needed to. But when they weren't budging at all, it became something where it became a little bit opposite. LBJ was like, well, I know how to make you do it. Either you want to go my way or we can go the hard way.
And that, in his early political year, that is not quite evident yet. But what you did say is very accurate. Very early on, he was savvy enough, shrewd enough, clever enough, manipulative enough to attach himself to the most powerful men in Texas corporations, Texas businesses, Desi Brown and Root, all these guys. He knew. And I mentioned Kennedy. Everybody knows that Richard Daley gave Kennedy the 1960 election up in Cook County. So this is not new. The fraud, the corruption, the ballot box stuffing, it's not new. And South Texas was one of Johnson's key support groups, right? Because the maps were drawn that his district was the hill country all the way down almost through the Rio Grande Valley. And down there, you had some very powerful Anglo landowners and such who controlled the Hispanic population, and they all voted for LBJ, even without the landslide ballots box stuffing. But anyway, once Johnson goes to Congress, goes to Washington, member of the House, he very quickly, wisely becomes a big supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, which most of you know, and you know, we've talked about this. And FDR returned the favor and became one of LBJ's strongest boosters, right? When Franklin Roosevelt came to go fish in the Gulf of Mexico, guess who was on that fishing boat? Who arranged it? Lyndon Johnson, right? When is to me one of the most important things about LBJ as a Southerner is the point in which he starts to break with his Southern colleagues on key social issues of the time. Okay. As a member of the House, he's very quiet in the sense that he votes mostly with his Southern compatriots on issues. But you got to remember, in the 30s and in the early war years, even though the New Deal had wound down considerably by the time the United States is in World War II, there's still a lot of benefit to be derived from New Deal policies and programs. And so LBJ wants to make sure Texas got his fair share. In fact, if you take any quote Southern state, which Texas is not, but let's put it in that category for the moment, Texas probably received more federal aid during the New Deal years, policies, programs, than any other quote Southern state. Largely thanks to Johnson and Rayburn and others, right? Very powerful politicians from Texas. But FDR, to his credit, realized that in many ways the future to victory for the South is to create a solid South, which meant it would vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Okay, which will be true through most of the 50s and 60s. Not always, but a lot of times true. When LBJ becomes Senator Johnson, this is when we see Johnson really emerge in his full grandiose glory and power. And we've talked about this before. He will become one of the most powerful senators ever in the history of the U.S. Senate. You'd be hard pressed to find but a handful of senators. I mean, you're talking to Henry Clay, a Daniel Webster from the 19th century, and you're talking, a handful in the 20th century. Those guys of the Gilded Age but they were lackeys of the plutocrats, but they were powerful, right? But Johnson, at a very crucial time, post World War II, 50s especially, that's kind of a pivotal decade, the 50s, when the United States when American culture and society, we have to wrestle with some very huge issues, most importantly, civil rights.
Can I ask one quick thing? Do you think that if, with hindsight, like knowing what he was getting into with the presidency, do you think he would have ever accepted it and he would have just stayed in the Senate?
Oh, had he known, no, I think we mentioned this before, but I am still that's a superb
He
thought-provoking
said on
quote.
so many tapes that he wished he'd just go back to the Senate. He said if
Sure, he
everybody
did.
knew the full responsibility of this presidency, like the weight that it had on him, and I'm sure he loved the benefits of it. I'm sure he loved all the things he could do with it.
He loved the power. He
But
loved the power.
he hated the number of articles that were coming out about him. He
Oh,
hated the number of phone calls he had to make a day. He hated the number of
yes.
times people just wanted something, never just to call up and say hello. LBJ always starts a conversation with some funny or some witty or something southerny, like some type of like interesting, like I'm interested in the conversation. But everyone that calls him is immediately Johnson this, Johnson that, Johnson this. And that's what I can see just tearing him down.
Yes. Well, yes. And that becomes extremely important during his, once the war starts to really consume his administration, which is from 65 on. Then those regrets, I can see him saying that. But remember, though, Robbie, your listeners, Johnson loved power. Power drove his entire politics and power. To Johnson, those were symbiotic, right? He saw himself the same way FDR did, as a powerful executive who had a duty to fulfill, a kind of messianic mission to fulfill the legacies of a powerful executive. His role model was FDR, not Kennedy, right? Certainly not Kennedy, not Eisenhower, but Roosevelt, who was undoubtedly the most powerful president in our entire history. Got guys in, president for life. And if you look at, we us liberals, we bitch and moan about Trump's usurpation of power with all his executive orders and decrees. I got news for you. FDR and broke the record on that stuff. But with Johnson, you don't see the regret, and that's probably the wrong word to use. You don't see the forlornness. That's a word of, of being president until Vietnam really starts to eat away at him. Until then, he relished it. Would he, if you asked him that question that you asked me in 1968, Mr. President, do you regret becoming president? I think he would have said no, because initially I had a vision, and he did have a vision, and that was to deliver a New Deal, a great society that went far beyond, far transcended what FDR had accomplished.
Well, with his style of presidency and his style in general throughout all his political career and just that Southerner aspect, do you think that was more of a benefit to him as a president domestically or overseas? Because a lot of the stuff he talked about with Vietnam is what exactly a lot of people kind of want. Like about bringing the boys home type deal when he does talk about that later on. But also, if they're going to go and kill one of our men, then we start bombing the next day. Like he's literally being a hard nose, which is what a lot of people wanted. Like Kennedy kind of got off on with the whole hard cold warrior aspect.
Oh, Kennedy was far more a cold warrior than Johnson. Johnson, his forte was not foreign policy. We've talked about this
Yeah.
before. Richard Russell remained one of his closest advisors even after he became president, and even through the
They talked like every other week on the phone.
yeah, they were very close. And Russell told him repeatedly, Mr. President, this war is going to destroy you. It's going to destroy the country. He referred to as a pissant country. Why are we wasting men and resources? This is going to bring you down. This is going to destroy your entire great society. Get out. So Russell was not, it was a cold warrior. They were all cold warriors to varying degrees. But Russell saw, and not just Russell, so did Fulbright, another Southern from Arkansas, J. William Fulbright, right? Brilliant senator, also warned Johnson. This is going to blow up in our face. It's not worth it.
Well, he listened, but he asked Fulbright, he asked everybody, he said, "What do you want me to do?" And they're like, "Just
Sure.
retreat, like get
Yeah.
out of there." And
Get
he's
out.
like, "How?" And then they could never finish the follow up. They just went silent. They're like, "I don't know, just get out." But he was like, "Tell me how, and I'll do it." I feel like I
Well,
try to attack this at every angle.
sure. But that's the problem. To Russell, Fulbright, and others, North and South, getting out meant simply, look, we cannot win this war. It'll cost us more men and money than any war we've ever fought. We cannot win for a variety of reasons, and they were correct. Just pull out. They, guys like Russell, Fulbright, and others, right, did not buy the domino theory. Ironically, they were better versed on the history of that region of the world than Johnson was. Look, the Chinese and the Southeast Asians have been enemies for a millennium, not that long, but for a long time. The Chinese aren't going to absorb into their empire, right? Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and places like that. Ho Chi Minh hates the Chinese more than he hates us. Pull out. And those guys were right. Those guys were right. But remember, and we've talked about this before too. We've talked about Vietnam. Johnson would listen to Russell, Fulbright, at all. But at the same time, he valued their information, but only to an extent. And you and I know this. The individuals that drove that war, who had Johnson convinced that we could win it, were guys like McNamara, Rostow, Bundy, Westmoreland. All those guys drove that agenda. And LBJ realizes they were wrong, too late to save his administration. As far as LBJ being, quote, the Southerner, if anything, reflected that he wasn't a Southerner, only one he wanted to be, right, for political reasons. It was civil rights, right? Johnson knew in his heart of hearts that that was the most important issue confronting post-war America, post-war United States. That had to be dealt with. Truman realized it, even. And he's, quote, a Southern. He's from Missouri, a slave state. But neither Truman or Roosevelt, neither Truman or Johnson identified themselves as Southerners. I'm convinced of that, right? Only when it was politically expedient to do so. For other programs, other projects, then he would put that thick Southern, quote, Texas drawl on, treat the, put his arm around Richard Russell and others, Talmadge and Maddox and all these racist guys, even George Wallace. Jesus. Only when he wanted something done. Only when he wanted them to stop doing something or needed their support on a bill. Also remember, too, when it came to civil rights, Johnson did not hesitate, was not afraid to come down hard with his power, executive power, to force a guy like George Wallace to adhere to the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65.
Why did he enforce it so much? Everyone, if you call him a Southerner, passing civil rights is not the first thing that comes to your mind when you think Southerner.
No, but to me, that's a great paradox, a great irony of U.S. history in the post-war period. If you look at the two presidents that did the most to promote and finalize or civil rights agenda, it's Truman first, and then Johnson. Quote, both Southerners. Kennedy's record on, we've talked about this repeatedly, Kennedy's record on civil rights is pretty dismal. I mean, he was much more cautious. I mean, granted, there was a lot of other issues JFK was dealing with. And so I don't want to be too harsh on LBJ. Eisenhower had the worst record of civil rights. My God. He hated civil rights, not personally per se, but he was a closet racist, Eisenhower. Johnson, was he a racist? That's debatable.
See, that's what everyone always mentions in the comments is calling him a racist and all. I'm like, he says Negro a lot on tapes. I'll give you that. But
that's the term used.
But again, when it came to civil rights, when it came to meeting with people like Martin Luther King, and when it came to doing these decisions, LBJ was on the forefront of that. Now, did he generally care about them? Probably not as much as he might give off in some of the tapes. I think a lot of his stuff was, why is this bill still being held up in the House? Why are we not have this many Republican votes? Well, call them up, get these Republicans to vote on this civil rights thing. He saw this bill that he was trying to get passed as he needs to do it, whether it was to keep people believing that he was going to keep Kennedy's stuff going, because he did polls on that. But he generally civil rights became a problem bill that was just sitting in the House. And he's like, how has this not gotten done yet? He's like, get to it. So I got my other stuff and we can vote on other stuff. He's like, you guys are going to take that. I think he made a statement in a phone call. I forgot who he was talking to, whether it was, I don't think it was Jack Valenti. I think it was Frank Irwin. But he was going off about like, oh, they're going to take January off and they'll be gone for 3 weeks. And the next, Mansfield's on the beach and he'll be there all of March. And he's going off. And he's like, if you really look at it, none of these people are here at all. They're all away. They're all on vacation. Humphreys is in Florida somewhere doing whatever. He was just going off on all these things that why it was taking so long. He's like, I need this passed this time. I need everyone to get here for this so I can get on to my other stuff. And I believe a lot of that might have been his promises with some of the oil industry people. Like he talked about Harry Byrd multiple times. And then people even brought it up. Like, did you make Albert Thomas, for instance, said, did you make sure you got that thing for Bird? You know, Bird's going to want that done. And then he was saying, like, yeah, I'm working on it. Like, he's doing things. He's not being orchestrated. He's just trying to make sure that the people that supported him in the beginning are still getting a piece of what, you know, he feels they were earned. And I think that's why a lot of times he was forcing things through, which he did force civil rights through. He
Oh, he had to. He
turned a lot of
did.
people's hands to do that.
Oh, yeah. He gave the Johnson treatment to so many Southerners. In Texas, he didn't really have that much of a problem with getting the Texans to vote it. Integration here compared to the rest of the quote South was much faster, much easier, minimal showdowns. There was no, Texas governor standing in the front of UT shouting segregation now, segregation forever. No. And and this was in the 50s, so long before LBJ becomes president. So he also knew, and you mentioned this just a few seconds ago, Republicans were the key votes, right? Northern Republicans. They were the key to pushing that through. He knew there was going to be a group of hardcore Southern racists in the Senate, in the House, no matter what kind of Johnson treatment they got, they weren't going to budge. And so he had no choice when it came down to the nut cutting, as he would say, to start to solicit key Republican votes. You look at the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, less so 65, 64 for sure. The key vote, the key voting bloc for the ultimate push to get that thing through were Republicans, Illinois, Michigan. And why Republicans? Simply, they saw votes. Let's not be.
I wish I could remember the guy's name who was saying that, but he kind of stated what Johnson said when it came to civil rights, where he said, I don't know why I'm the only one as a Democrat with the flag here holding it up for our party to go forward on these civil rights bills. It seems like the Democrats were being hesitant, which was weird because the Republicans did take a shift around 65 ish, 64. It seemed like they were kind of taking more of a shift towards voting for it and kind of coming on board with it because they didn't see it as as a problem as they did before. I think it was because there was so much support maybe from the Democrats that they just didn't want to be lumped in the same thing. It seemed like a lot of the votes, once the Democrats kind of fall back, you see the Republicans voting more.
Well, with Kennedy, yes, it's really interesting. That's a very good point because with Kennedy's last year after Birmingham in '63, Kennedy's last year in office, right in '63, especially after Birmingham, then King's speech in Washington in August of that year. That's a turning point for Kennedy. He gets on television, gives that speech. It's time, blah blah blah. But then he's killed. It's a few months later. But the bill had already been chopped to bits in the House, was never going to get off that committee until LBJ. But when you look at the members of those various committees in the House, especially, you already had Republicans saying, "Jesus, we should jump on this political bandwagon, take that energy out of the Democrats, because we have substantial African American populations in some of our most important major cities in the North, in a Cleveland, in a Detroit, etc. These are places still up for grabs for House votes. I mean, members in the House, right? Republicans. Some of the most powerful Republican senators and members of the House are from like Illinois, Indiana, Michigan in this time period, right? And so they're going to jump on that bandwagon. And don't forget, these guys are all very shrewd, clever politicians. And they saw why not? Why not promote civil rights? Why not support a Voting Rights Act even? And remember too, as well, that Voting Rights Act really was only applicable to the South. In northern Republican and Democratic states, African Americans had been voting for already several years, maybe a couple decades. They've been incorporated into the electoral process, particularly in Republican states. And Republicans could boast. Many Republicans could boast by the time of the 60s, hey, our African American population has been voting in state local national elections for since the 40s, 30s, not 30s, but 40s, 50s. So that's not an issue. Where Johnson, but nonetheless, Johnson will cultivate strong ties with key Republicans in the House and the Senate to get their support. He needed their support, needed their vote, which often proved decisive on those civil rights bills, particularly 64 and then 65 was 65 will pass. The momentum of 64 Civil Rights Act will help push through much easier. There'll still be a fight, largely by Southern opposition for some of the Democrats, the Voting Rights Act, right? But once you got guys jumping on the bandwagon like Lester Maddox and whatever, say, hey, why not? We could use their votes. You got African American populations in states like Mississippi and Alabama, even parts of Georgia, that are an entire voting district. And if you show your support for them, et cetera, they're going to vote for you. George Wallace will win more black votes after in the 70s than he did in white votes at certain times. George Wallace, Lester Maddox. You couldn't find two more hardcore racist governors, politicos in the South. Lester Maddox, I remember I was a freshman in college or senior in high school. Lester Maddox, you could find this online. Some of your listeners may remember this if they're an old geezer like me. Lester Maddox, there was a huge strike of hospital workers, nurses, orderlies, and such in Georgia. And they went on strike. And these are the key workers in the hospital, right? If they go on strike, you're screwed, right? Lester Maddox will get a picket sign. You can probably find this online. It's fascinating. Get a picket sign and march with these striking nurses and orderlies and such who are 99% African American because he doesn't want them on the welfare program. He says, no, this is what we need. These people need to be paid in valuable services. Lester Maddox, of all people. It's an incredible video or whatever news clip.
Staying along the lines of LBJ and the Southerner, though, I wanted to kind of bring it and extend it a little bit. Him and Hoover had one of the best relationships. Now, if it was a business relationship, I think J. Edgar Hoover's quoted as saying, "I'd rather have Hoover inside my tent pissing out than outside my tent pissing in." Which obviously it's like kind of being friends with the devil a little bit. But they could, if they're both in line with their same kind of ideas and what they kind of do a little bit, Hoover maybe might be a little bit more drastic. Their mentalities aren't the same though. It's Hoover's not coming from a Southerner background. He's coming from a Boy Scout background. Like a very hard nosed, everything for my country. Everything is an enemy that is not in line with my ideas or beliefs type deal.
His personal ideas, yes.
Yes. So I think with LBJ, it's a little bit different. He kind of saw it as more of like when other foreign entities attacked, it was an attack on America, and that's how LBJ took it. But when Hoover saw anything domestically, even as attack on America, Johnson didn't have that mentality of everything that was attacking him domestically. I think he got to a point where he said the railroad bombings that Hoover was investigating was becoming something that this country does not do. We don't have mass bombings or these types of things because railroad strikes were happening because of the railroad labor that was going on. But when he was talking with Hoover about it, and Hoover couldn't find anybody, or their FBI didn't have any leads at all. He was stating that this is not what America does. We're not a country that bombs itself. This leads us into something darker. And Johnson's on tapes talking about that. And his mentality is like, I've never heard him say anything about that domestically. He's always seen attacks from foreign entities as like something that they're attacking us as a nation. But Hoover took that in a different way. He was the Boy Scout mentality, but had it as a sense of even domestic problems or attack on this great nation.
Yes. And Hoover, anytime the far left, the SDS, the Weathermen, those organizations,
The Weathermen were the best people at blowing up urinals and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hoover.
I love the Weathermen.
A bizarre man. I'll just put it that way. I have yet to really understand Herbert Hoover. as much as
What, Herbert or J. Edgar?
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Jesus.
Edgar is who I'm talking about.
J. Edgar Hoover. Yeah, no, Herbert Hoover. I'm so sorry. Jesus, where's
Hey,
my
at least
head?
you know I'm listening.
Yeah, you are listening, thank God. Still jet lag. No, no excuses. J. Edgar Hoover was a bizarre man. I mean, Roosevelt gave him the entree to his career um, for a variety of reasons, and he seized a lot of that opportunity himself with the rise of the gangsters in the early 30s, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde, all that stuff. There was a need for a federal law enforcement agency. There was a need for an FBI eventually. I think Roosevelt saw that. But unfortunately, you've got a lot of presidents, beginning with Roosevelt, all the way through Nixon, who turned a blind eye for whatever reason to allowing Hoover to usurp so much power in that office and allowed Hoover to gather all kinds of nefarious information about all kinds of Americans that you said he suspected were going to do evil to this country. And he would use that and he would blackmail people with that information. Monday we celebrate MLK's birthday and heroism. And I watched several of the documentaries they put out on Monday. And it just, to this day, it still amazes me how much dirt, some of it accurate, most of it not, that Hoover collected on MLK. This is no surprise to you or anybody. It's particularly his sexual activities, his womanizing escapades. But I still wonder to this day how much of that was true and how much it was doctored by Hoover. I mean, it's like anything that you hit the nail on the head. Hoover had this, that's a great term, Boy Scout, this incredible self righteous Boy Scout view of the United States as being white and clean and virtuous and all American Anglo Saxon, all this bullshit, right? When Hoover himself, as everyone knows, was in the closet and sometimes not. I mean, he was homosexual, gay guy. And I think presidents knew that. But for some reason, they feared him. Fear's the wrong word. That's too strong for the guy like
I think it
LBJ.
was more in your best interest to have Hoover as a friend rather than as an enemy.
Precisely. That's why I said feared is the wrong word.
There was too many
Uh,
times I think people mentioned about like just staying on his good side or not.
yes.
The weird thing for me is we've talked about LBJ and RFK's relationship. Have we ever discussed RFK and Hoover's relationship? Because it's very conflated on people saying that they hated each other, which I believe there's probably some of that, but they both did wiretapping together.
No. Yes. No. I think if any dynamic duo, Bobby and John, those two, if anyone feared or had reservations about Hoover, it would be the Kennedy brothers. For whatever reason, I don't know. Was it the same daddy complex that made them fear their own father, Joe Kennedy, who was a horrible tyrant? Did Hoover treat them the same way? Perhaps. I don't know. I don't want to put
This
him on the
might get me
count.
in trouble with Kennedy people, but in honesty, I think it was because they kept such a pure look that when they did their stuff, smoking weed, taking LSD, whatever any of these things were that John and RFK did, whether it was with Marilyn Monroe or whatever,
Yeah.
I think that's the side of them that they didn't want public, and they knew
Oh,
Hoover could
no.
find out that information very quickly.
Thus, they quote, feared him. So we'll use the word fear. I mean, if that's appropriate. Um, but yeah, Bobby, more than John, uh, saw Hoover with value, particularly when he was Attorney General. It's Bobby's an Bobby and civil rights have a very interesting relationship. John was a little more sincere about it. Bobby was ruthless. We talked about this before. Bobby was of the brothers, the three political brothers, Bobby, John, and Teddy. Bobby was by far the most ruthless when it came to campaigning for his brother in 60, right? And as Attorney General, I don't know what Bobby will become a big fan of the downtrodden and the forsaken and the forgotten and the marginalized, but not until he becomes Senator Kennedy and then runs for president. I think Teddy was far more committed to that. John will never know really, but as relative to Hoover and Bobby, I think Bobby saw Hoover having potential great value to him in his political career.
I
To
mentioned
what?
this recently to William Arnone, who's going to be on the show. He worked for RFK in his 1968 campaign. And got to actually meet him and stuff. But he said to me that everyone always kind of told him, like, you're not going to like him when you meet him. He's very to the point. He's very get out of my way type mentality. Again, you said his nickname on the Hill was Little Shit, but he
Yeah.
was more conservative minded.
Yes.
I would say if you look at JFK's kind of campaign or his life as presidency, that the brief time it was, his is what happens when you don't follow the political club or the president's club. Johnson's when all you know is the political club. And
Yes.
RFK is when you want to destroy the political club.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe why he got close to Hoover. Hoover had things to teach.
Oh,
And
sure.
RFK saw that. How can I do
Oh,
the
yeah.
wiretapping to use to my own benefit? How can I do all these other things instead of using them on Americans against your adversaries?
Yes, I think when you have your other guest on who worked for Bobby, my older brother worked for Bobby too, but Bobby not as closely as your guest did.
Again, apologies for my voice. Sorry.
No, no, don't even worry about it. I understand totally. Bobby, by far, I mean, you look at all of even Schlesinger admits Bobby could be outright mean, ruthless, vicious in his uh, in his approaches to issues and protecting his family, his brothers, and his own political career. He was a slicer and a dicer. He only mellowed, and I'm sure your guest will mention this, he only starts to mellow when he starts to run for president. And he realizes, and he'll have advice from others, like Schlesinger, you can't be this person anymore. If you want to win the hearts and minds of the American people, you can no longer come across as this cut and dry, straightforward, self righteous prig, ruthless campaigner. It's not going to work. This is 1968. Times have changed since 1960. And if you want to become president of the United States, you have to show the public this other side. A man of compassion, a man of humanity, a man who understands the plight of the poor and the marginalized. And he starts to do that when he gives that great speech to the African American community in Indianapolis, the day that MLK is killed. And then you begin to see this metamorphosis take place with Bobby, which I'm sure your guest will confirm this. But it took him a while to get there, Bobby. And so the Bobby Kennedy that I saw, you're too young, but others saw, by the time of his death, his assassination, his murder, that's the Bobby that people hoped would be forever. We'll never know. But until that campaign, he's questionable. And remember, he's a cold warrior still. Even to the day of his death, he's a cold warrior. He was pleased by Johnson's negotiations with the with the uh, with the North Vietnam, bring him to the Paris Peace Conference. But he also said publicly that he opposed the draft dodgers. He opposed those rich kids who are getting out of the draft, right? Opposed that. And he also gave a kind of a vague timetable that if the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh and gang do not cooperate in getting this a peace settlement, then we'll resume the bombing. That's a fact. He said that publicly. And so Hugh G. McCarthy, by contrast, said no. We're not going to do. I'm not threatening that. That's not part of my peace initiative. So, yeah, Bobby's interesting guy.
What would you say would be left that we missed on the Southerner aspect of LBJ? Like when it
Oh,
came to
okay.
either
I
inner
think,
political workings or dealing with the public. I don't see a lot of response necessarily from the public. It seems like more of the press stuff that gets kind of left behind in the tapes. We don't see a lot of LBJ dealing with issues of like the reception in places. Everywhere that I've or everything that I've heard from other people has been that there's been strong receptions of LBJ's speeches and LBJ's it's like, yeah, but this Times article wrote about me and all this type of thing. It kind of goes off there, but it seems like there's not a big resistance to Johnson's ways. It kind of seems like people were indifferent on him.
well, if you look at Johnson's speeches, the text of his speeches were brilliant. But
Which
you had to listen
ones
to
that were written by Sorensen or written
of
by,
course, Sorensen,
Goodwin or
Goodwin, McPherson. I mean, he had some great speech writers. They were brilliant. And but he's so hard to listen to because of his delivery. He was not a great orator. He
I
was
like
so
it though. It sounds good.
yeah, it sounds good. Johnson was, and they're brilliant, and the substance of them are brilliant. They're sincere, and he, in his defense, his delivery was so bad because of his stupid Texas drawl, which sometimes he intensified or exacerbated because he wanted to sound Southern, right? Which is, oh, yeah, what are you thinking, right? But the texts are brilliant. The substance of brilliant speeches. But even though the public saw Johnson in general, a guy living in California, or a guy living in Massachusetts, or a guy living in North Dakota, saw Johnson as a Southern. He was not a Southerner. He was a Texan with a Southern cultural background. Most Texans were. That's not true anymore. Right? You go up to Austin, Texas right now. Native Texans that live in Austin are few and far between. Right. And that's, it's even true of Houston to a certain degree, large degree. Right. But he never saw himself as a quote Southerner. He would appropriate that mantle, wrap himself in it for political reasons when he needed those Southern votes. He wanted a Talmadge or a Maddox or a Wallace or pick one, Wilbur Wright, and those guys in Arkansas. When he wanted their support, he would wrap himself in that Southern mantle, exacerbate that drawl, and never let them forget he was a Southerner, just like them. But he wasn't, and he never saw himself. His wife, Lady Bird, wonderful first lady. I was listening to some conversations between Lady Bird after LBJ had died. So Lady Bird and Bill Moyers. And she remember Bill Moyers? You know Bill Moyers. Yeah, great guy. He's a Texan, right? And you listen to Moyers. He's from Austin. He's from Texas. You can pick up a little bit of his drawl, right? But he doesn't sound like Johnson, right? Walter Cronkite was from Houston, Texas. Give me a break, right? So, and Lady Bird would say, "Oh God, Lyndon would drive me crazy when he becomes." I'm paraphrasing. Become Southern. Oh my God, he would embarrass his daughters because if you listen to his two daughters, they sure as hell didn't sound like a bunch of Southern belles at all, right? and so it would drive him crazy. But it was all for political show. Never forget with LBJ, and I think people miss this because he always seemed every time, particularly as the war started to consume him, he appeared to be so solemn and withdrawn and sullen, and rightly so. But he was flamboyant as hell, right? He was gregarious. He would tell the most lewd jokes. You know this, right? In front of everybody. He was essentially a larger than life 6'4" Texan, right? And if you look at a lot of his political showmanship, he presents himself physically, appearance wise, more of a Texan's always got that big 10-gallon hat on. Next, love to take everybody up to the LBJ Ranch. Well, the LBJ Ranch is guess where in the heart of the Texas Hill Country. He saw himself as a Texan.
What do you think he did that because he wanted to get out of the more White House setting? It
Oh
seemed
yes,
like not just for the privacy of it on his own ranch, but he was more
yes,
comfortable going to
yes.
the ranch than being around the White House. Even in his press conversations, he was constantly going outside for walks.
But when you get him down in that ranch, one on one with his buddies and political power brokers, he's a whole different guy. I told you this before. Toward the end of his life, he last year of his life, he rode around his ranch on his horse, had let his hair grow way down to his shoulders, looked like Ben Franklin, right? He's got a little bald spot up there, and would sit there and ride around his ranch all day long. He became the quintessential cowboy, right? He's went back to his roots, a good old roper, cedar chopper redneck. I mean, he wasn't, but he was a smart guy, Johnson. But that's who he was. That's when, like you said, that he was most comfortable in those informal environments, settings where he could really be truthful. And when you got him on the ranch, well, one of the best books I ever read about Johnson was called Big Daddy from the Pedernales, and great book, talks about this aspect of Johnson, right? How he was most comfortable on his ranch, most comfortable in Texas. He felt he could be himself, be more honest with people, not play political games and political showmanship. And that's when some of the most important decisions of his presidency were made were on that ranch with his advisors, right? Of course, right? McNamara hated coming to the ranch. The Eastern establishment hated coming to the ranch. But guys like Rayburn and others, when they were around, Clark Clifford didn't mind it. I mean, those guys, they came. They enjoyed it. LBJ showed them a big barbecue all the time.
I think because LBJ knew the kind of importance of intimacy, whether it was friendship or whether it was anything you want to say, but really when it came to the number of agents that were at his ranch, he's like, why the hell do you have 80 something ranches or 80 something agents at my ranch with 16 different Lincolns or Fords or out there sitting on the property when I'm not even there? Like, you guys are being ridiculous with this whole protection aspect of things. And again, that's coming from the man who established Secret Service security for presidential candidates after RFK died.
After RFK. It was a smart move. Smart move. You know, it's interesting about Johnson.
He didn't
I
even wait
think
for
you
it to be
know.
passed in the House. He just did it. And then
Yeah.
he let everybody catch up to him.
Yes. It was very good. It was one of the best things he ever did. You mentioned loyalty. We have a president now who demands it, beyond demands it. Johnson, as much as I hate to make an analogy between Johnson and Trump, Johnson also was a big stickler about loyalty. Not so much personal loyalty, but a truthful loyalty from his advisors. A personal loyalty, yes, but more important to Johnson, he wanted the men he thought he could trust to be counted on to give him the truth, the hard, cold truth. To me, that's a manifestation of loyalty. And this is why Johnson felt so betrayed and just personally devastated, wounded when McNamara comes to him in 67 and tells him finally the truth about Vietnam. Mr. President, we can't win. And Johnson, that devastated Johnson because he had come to believe in the sense of a personal loyalty that he could trust a guy like McNamara to tell him the truth, or Bundy, or Rostow, right? Richard Russell always told Johnson the truth, whether LBJ wanted to hear it or not. Richard said, "No, Mr. President, this is gonna blow up on our faces. Get out. I don't give a damn how you get out. Just get out. It's gonna destroy your presidency, destroy all your vision." And so, yes, Johnson demanded loyalty, but not the kind of loyalty that this current president demands.
On a wrapping point, what would you say would be a takeaway for people who view Johnson as the obviously comments you've probably seen that get mentioned about Johnson, whether it's being racist and all those types of things, and really trying to understand the aspect of being, from the South or a Southerner mentality? Um, I want you to kind of give a takeaway for people here based on what we've just talked about and everything we've kind of made comparisons on. Because again, a lot of the stuff where people say LBJ was this or LBJ was that or LBJ was rude and disgusting is like not really. I mean, he was a person that took probably the presidency just as serious, but did not let it become where he could not be himself if he wanted to be himself.
No. And he was always himself on his ranch. And sometimes in the White House, he would be himself too, but more when he's on his ranch. He let his hair down, so to speak. Right? No, was LBJ? Could LBJ be crass and crude and lewd and off color? Yes. Yes, of course. He was human. Right? But to me as an historian, to me as a Texan, to me as a fan of LBJ in many ways, he was committed to serving this country. Not personal power, yes, that came with the office, and he knew it. But he believed that power, like Roosevelt, must be used for the good of the country, for the good of the American people. That's why his Great Society was so important, because he wanted to cure as many of these social economic ills that confronted the American people. He wanted to make this nation the Great Society, a nation where there was no racism. Well, good luck with that. I mean, it was kind of a little grandiose expectation, Johnson, but that's what he worked for: to end poverty, to end hunger, make sure every American had a job, to clean up the environment. If you look at his Great Society vision, that Great Society agenda, it is incredible. Some of it's still around today. Many student loans are available that started with Johnson. I mean, there's still so many programs, right? And that's what separates a guy like Johnson from many other presidents. Yes, he was crude and crass and vulgar and would swear. And was he a womanizer? That's still debatable. Maybe, I don't know. I would hate to think so, but I don't get the impression that he was, compared to, say, a Trump or a Kennedy or others, Bill Clinton, right? I'm sure he fooled around. I have no real hard evidence about that. But that's what separates Johnson from a lot of presidents, in my opinion, is that above all else, take away all of his other shortcomings and flaws, which they all have, he was committed, dedicated, and he wanted to really make this country the Great Society. And now, would that also satisfy his ego of leaving behind a legacy even greater than FDR's? Oh, sure. Sure it would. He had a big ego, huge ego. But he saw power, the use of it, for the good. Did he abuse his power? Did he lie, say, for Tonkin Gulf? Yes. But in his mind, I'm not justifying Tonkin Gulf and the bombing of North Vietnam. That proved to be a colossal mistake. In his mind, he believed that he could use that to end the war. He honestly believed that if we could bomb the shit out of poor North Vietnam, it would bring him to the peace table, war would be over. And I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can continue with my vision, the Great Society. Was he a racist? I don't think so. I don't think so. Sure, he used the word Negro. That was the polite term to be used, I promise you, in this time period. Now, eventually, if you go beyond, move toward after Black Power and stuff, you hear Johnson use the word black as opposed to Negro more and more. All right. Now, was he prompted by Califano and others to, Mr. President, that's no longer a word we use. We're going to use black or Afro-American. And he embraced those ideas. But was he a racist? No. Was he like a Wallace or somebody like that? No. I would be hard pressed. Someone would really have to show me, convince me of that.
Well, Mr. Moretta, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about this. I always love talking about LBJ just because there's a lot of interesting things you can find in those tapes. And kind of listening to them, even just as like a side thing, just enhances my own knowledge on other characters that were in the administration and learning about him in his complicated administration myself. But I wanted to give you the time here to be able to promote your links. And we'll wrap up here. And, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I hope
Same here, my friend. As always, hope you feel better.
Yeah, give people a rest from my voice, I guess.
No, you're good, man.
When your book comes out, I want to have you back on as well, too, to be able to discuss
Yeah, for
that.
sure. It'll be in the spring, probably, looking right now, probably early summer, June. I got a lot of cutting to do still.
Well, where can people find you at?
Oh, just Google John Moretta. All the stuff I have comes up.
Well, I'll
Real
make sure
simple.
to link all the previous links I've linked before in the episode description below so people listening can be able to click on your stuff.
Yeah. I hope they enjoyed it.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.